Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Colonel Arthur Athens. I have the honor of serving as the director of the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership that Director Free mentioned a few moments ago. It's my pleasure to moderate the very first panel of our leadership conference. The title of it is Crisis Leadership at the Helm in Heavy Seas. Crisis leadership has always been a subject of particular interest for me personally. That probably started about 3 decades ago when I had an assignment with the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and there was a certain launch of a space shuttle by the name of Challenger on the 28th of January 1986, where 73 seconds into that flight, the orbiter broke apart and we lost 7 great astronauts and had a big setback for the U.S. space program. During that time, I was able to watch a leader, Dr. Jim Fletcher, who became the administrator after that accident. I watched him take the helm and navigate through those very difficult waters. Since that time, I've had the opportunity to lead in crisis, observe others, and we are always surprised when the crisis comes, but perhaps we shouldn't be, because crisis is part of life, and it's also certainly a part of being a leader. So we're very fortunate today to have 3 distinguished panelists, Ben Sliney, Major Russel Lewis, and J.D. Messenger. Unfortunately, the 4th member of the panel originally scheduled, Anu Bagwadi, could not come because of an illness. But each of these panelist members have weathered the heavy seas, and they've helped their organizations not only come through that heavy sea, but ensure that their organization was ready for the calmer seas and the next heavy sea again. So our plan this morning is I'm going to introduce each panelist in turn, have them give some brief remarks about a crisis that they face. After all 3 panelists have finished, then I will have the opportunity to open it up for questions and answers, and then we'll get you on to lunch. But I think this will be a great panel for you, and that's because of the panelists that have been brought together. Again, leaders who have experienced it firsthand and can answer many of the questions that probably roll around your mind about leading in crisis. So let me introduce our first panelist, Mr. Ben Sliney. Mr. Sliney began his air traffic control career in the United States Air Force, and we still invited him here, but anyway, and continued that career with the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA. On September 11, 2001, Mr. Sliney was the National Operations Manager at the FAA's Air Traffic Control System Command Center. And on that fateful day, issued the order to close all U.S. airspace after the terrorist attacks in New York City and Washington, D.C., and then began the complex supervision process to ensure this action was completed safely and efficiently. Mr. Sliney portrays himself in the movie United 93 that depicts the events of 9/11 and dramatizes the heroic actions of the passengers aboard that flight. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Sliney.
First, thank you for having me. Even though I was in the Air Force, I can say my father was a commander in the Navy during World War II, and perhaps you'll allow me access to this wonderful facility again. So I thought, as I arrived to work, that was, by the way, my first day on the job, 9/11. I had retired or resigned from the FAA some 10 years earlier and set about practicing law. You can make a lot more money practicing law than you can, but it's a lot less exciting, the practice of law. And I arrived, quite frankly, at the command center on 9/11. It was just a magnificent day. Those of you who recall the weather on that day, it was just a crystal clear blue sky from Maine to Florida. And of course, the early part of the day is where air traffic builds on the East Coast and gradually later on west as the time zones come into play. But I thought it would be a very, very easy job, my first day on that job. And I set about my activities in a routine way. The National Operations Manager is given the charge for the safe and efficient operation of all the nation's airspace. And I have a staff that of 40 or so, and the command center is at that time, it's moved now, but it's a cavernous room, maybe 40, 50 feet wide and 100 or so feet long, and the ceilings are quite high. And it's populated by a lot of electronic gadgetry, large screens that we can depict the weather on, or air traffic, or anything that we want to. And I was set out to deliver a briefing on the previous day's operations, my analysis of what was good and what was not about the previous day. And as I left to go to that meeting, one of my supervisors stopped me and indicated that there was a possible hijacking out of Boston, American 11 from Boston to LAX. And having been experienced through the 60s and 70s with hijacks, I was not concerned. We had protocols in place to handle those, and I told the supervisor to keep me apprised of any developments, and I went to the meeting. Within minutes, that same supervisor came into the meeting to tell me that we had information that a flight attendant had been stabbed. And this was a deviation from at least my expectation of how hijackings should run their course. And I returned to the operational floor and set up in the center of the floor to have my personnel give me information regarding the events that were then unfolding. As we were, of course, American 11, as you all know now, the hijackers dove the aircraft to a lower altitude and shut the transponders off, which is a electronic device that enables us to identify the aircraft altitude, airspeed, etc. So we had no way of knowing where the aircraft was, but we knew that at a point in western Massachusetts, the aircraft turned south and headed towards New York. We were in the process, or my staff was, of alerting facilities and radar facilities along that route of flight to see if anyone could identify American 11. We were unsuccessful in that. And during a few minutes later, there was a Air Force colonel liaison to the command center, told me that I may want to put CNN up because they had reported that a small plane had struck the North Tower of the World Trade Centers. And of course, I did put it up on the screens that we have in the facility are 8 to 10 feet wide and high. And I put CNN up, and my first impression was the conflagration was so huge in that building that I knew it wasn't a small plane. I feared it was American 11, but I had no confirmation of that. And we set out to notify or get in touch with the local police, New York City Police Department, Fire Department, see if anyone had reported what had struck that building. As we were doing that, and I maintained a position in the center of this floor, and like the hub of a spoke, and the personnel assigned to me would come to me, give me information, go back to their positions of operation. And I stayed there, in fact, the entire time, at least trying to be, at least present an aura of calmness for the personnel working there. And as we were in that process, we saw live on CNN United 175 come around and strike the South Tower. Excuse me, yes, the South Tower. And of course, that was a horrifying sight for anyone at all, especially people in aviation, to see an aircraft of that size hit that building with the force that it did and the resultant explosion. But I knew two things at that point. I knew first that it was American 11 in the other building, and two, I knew that this wasn't an isolated act, that this was a concerted action by a group of people, although I did not know who. We had no information regarding this possibility at that time, and it was very perplexing. And the most perplexing thing, I thought, was I try to understand how the hijackers could have forced the pilot to fly the plane into the building. I did not comprehend that the hijackers were flying the plane. That was not my experience, and it never entered my head on that day that they flew the plane. So I was trying to reason out how they could possibly force a pilot to fly that, into that building, when I know the credo of all pilots is that to avoid loss of life on the ground, and would sacrifice that plane, put it in the East River or the Hudson River or the Hudson or the East River or the Atlantic Ocean, in fact, to avoid an impact with a building, killing all the people on board and killing everyone, as it turned out, in the building. And I never did figure that out that day, and it was, of course, it's very easily understandable, but not in my experience. And I was kind of trapped in that paradigm, although for the bulk of that day, I attempted to figure out what was going on and try to get control of the situation. After that, when United 175 struck that building, I issued an order that grounded, that did not allow any other aircraft to take off into the national airspace system nationwide. This is called a ground stop, and I did that as soon as the United 175 struck that building. In the meantime, we had developed a grease board, because we had no electronics to present it, where we tried to develop a list of all the suspicious aircraft in the nation, and I defined suspicious for everyone as any aircraft that changed their altitude, changed their heading, changed their transponder, or anything else that the individual controller might deem suspicious. And quickly we had 14 or 15 planes in the nation identified as suspicious. All those, including United 93 and including American 77 and including American 11, which we still did not know for sure was in that building, although I was pretty confident that it was. And from the beginning of the entire episode on 9/11, it ran about 75 minutes from, although it seemed a lot longer in the passing as I worked that day. And the next thing that occurred was American 77 striking the Pentagon. And it was at that juncture, in the reactive mode that I was in that day, that I issued the order that all aircraft in the nation should land at the nearest airport, regardless of the destination. Additionally, I shut off the borders, north, south, east, and west, so that no aircraft could enter American airspace from that point forward. I'm sure you all may recall the pictures in the media of the queues of aircraft up on the ground in Canada, and the people coming out to help them with blankets and food and took them into their homes. A remarkable story for the Canadians, and one I felt very proud of them for doing that. Although they weren't that happy that I had just shut the door, but I felt national security was at issue, and I had opened up at the initial part of the morning a line to headquarters in Washington, and was seeking any information from those people in the headquarters building regarding what actions could have or should be taken or what should be done. I never heard from them on that day, except after. I'll tell you about that when I get to it. But it took, at the time I gave the order to land, there were approximately 5,300 aircraft airborne. And it took just about 2 hours. We landed nearly 3,500 in the first hour. And I've always said it was a remarkable day that displayed the skill of the aviation community. Not only the air traffic controllers who put the aircraft into queues and got them on the ground, but also the flight crews, including the attendants in the back, who had to calm people when those planes started going off course and heading for destinations that the passengers, of course, knew nothing about what was going on. Neither did the pilots, for that matter. But it was a remarkable amount of cooperation to enable us to safely and efficiently land all 5,400 aircraft on that day within 2 hours. And that, as we found, it was quite easy it turned out, it was quite easy to land all the planes and stop the system. It was another matter to get the system started up again. It took many weeks before we were able to get the aviation community back in the air and flying, mostly a matter of security. Hence, From 9/11 forward, airlines had to demonstrate their security capability in loading the planes, and that was the beginning, of course, of the intense security that we see now at airports. And as far as I'm concerned, they couldn't have enough of it. They should have more security, in my view. I'd like to, as all of you do, you want to be assured that you're going to get where you're going when you get on that plane and not be interrupted by some maniac. So that pretty much wrapped up by noon of that day. The events started unfolding around 8:30 in the morning, and by noon of that day, it was deathly quiet in the skies over America, as all those aircraft had landed and safely, and people tried to go about their lives, although I understood you could not rent a car on that day to save your life, to get back to your home or wherever you wanted to get to once that aircraft landed. Thank you.
I'll just mention as an aside there, if you go to Google and look up NASA 9/11 air traffic time-lapse photography, there's an amazing video that shows all the air traffic off over the United States and then how it goes to absolute nothing. It's just incredible. Our second panelist is Major Russel Lewis. Major Lewis was commissioned in 1994 into the Parachute Regiment, the airborne infantry of the British Army. His operational experience includes tours in Northern Ireland, Kosovo, and Iraq. In 2008, he commanded B Company 2 Para in the Helm province of Afghanistan, where for 6 brutal months he and his company fought a determined and aggressive enemy. In 2009, he was awarded the Military Cross, Britain's 3rd highest decoration for valor. Major Lewis's citation for his actions reads in part, "Resolute in defense, tenacious and courageous in attack, Lewis has set an outstanding example to B Company at significant personal risk and has been an inspiration to all ranks." He is also the author of the recently published book, Company Commander, that describes his combat experiences in Afghanistan. Please join me in welcoming Major Lewis.
Thank you very much. It's a huge honor to be invited over here. I'm so grateful to be a part of this, and to be sat with such esteemed speakers as well is a real honor. What I'd like to do is just very briefly sort of set out my stall, and as we've all been doing, we'll talk through one incident in particular, which is the sort of where I had my leadership epiphany. And I'm just going to give you the incident and then a few thoughts, which will hopefully stimulate some questions once we get into that. First of all, my Cs, I was commanding my company just north of Sangin, which most people have heard of, in an area that would be currently occupied by the United States Marine Corps. An area in the green zone of Afghanistan, which is a very nasty environment. And I think really my rough seas with a 6-month tour were firstly the environment. For those who've been there, you'll know it's summer tours are very hot. The green zone is effectively a jungle, and it's a hard place to work and carry 50, 60 pounds of equipment and fight a determined enemy. The conditions themselves were part of the rough seas. Living in a forward operating base, I'm afraid that the British were not quite as well resourced as our American counterparts, which means that our resupplies were few and far between, which meant, for example, at one point I had to backload 2 of my soldiers to our main operating base with malnutrition, which sounds like a sort of thing from medieval warfare, not from the current century. And obviously the enemy, the enemy get to play as well, and so provide constant friction whether you're on the ground or actually in the forward operating base. But my heavy seas, I lost 3 soldiers in one incident to a suicide bomber, which I'm just going to give you a bit more detail of, and some of my thoughts about what I learned on that day. My ship, though, most importantly, is a rifle company, is about 100 men, but in the forward operating base I had another 120 under command, so I had 220 soldiers under command, which is a lot of people to have day-to-day responsibility for. So my leadership, my heavy seas was, as I said, it's a single patrol. I had about 75 people on the ground, which again is quite a lot of people to coordinate as one person in a jungle, effectively. It's interesting how you remember the weather and the conditions. I can remember it perfectly as well. It was also a lovely day, and it was also a fantastic patrol. We probably covered most ground that we covered up to that point. I was sort of on my A game, was flying well, controlling it well. You could tell the soldiers were on good form as well. It was all going very well. But as I said, the weather is a big factor. So this patrol had been going well, and we had been gathering quite a lot of intelligence, but it's starting to get warmer and warmer. So I made the call that we would cut half the patrol off and just basically head straight back towards the forward operating base. And I'd basically just been told by the Sergeant Major that people were starting to run out of water, which is obviously a factor. So I told the lead platoon just to make basically straight line, straight back towards the forward operating base, the best route that you see fit. I then received an intelligence update that the enemy were in the area, and they use code words, but they'd set up the big thing. And the big thing normally means RPG, that they're going to fire an RPG at you. But we were on our way back in, so I sort of didn't ignore it, but okay, so be it. And then 5 minutes later, there was an explosion. And I was about 100 meters back from the explosion, but obviously in a jungle environment, 100 meters is, I couldn't see what happened. I just heard the explosion. And it sounds awful, but I was a bit flippant about it, thinking that's obviously the RPG's just been fired. So I sent a quite relaxed contact report on my radio network. But then I think the first thing to sort of draw out with leadership is about leaving people alone in a crisis. I didn't want to get on my radio and start hassling the commander at the front as to what was going on, because I just left it for him to deal with. But after a couple of minutes, I couldn't leave it any longer. So rather than get on the radio, I thought I'd just run forward and go and see what had happened. So I jogged across the open ground with my detachment. I have quite a few guys with me with radios and snipers and forward air observers and all the rest of it. And I got to the back of an alleyway, track alleyway, and the soldiers there were actually again grinning. It's just interesting. Just, all right, sir, just head up the alley there. There's just up there. And I think they obviously assumed I knew what had gone on. So I started to walk up this alley, and there was a very strong smell of explosive. You could smell this is where the explosive happened, and still some dust in the air. And then I saw one of my soldiers tending to another soldier, and he was wrapping in his arm in a bandage. And I just thought, oh, thank God for that. It's just a guy being caught on the arm. That's not too bad, no problem. And then that soldier looked at me and said, oh, sir, you need to keep going. The others are just further up the alley. And as I walked just a bit further up the alley, I was confronted with this vision of hell, which was 3 of my soldiers down on the ground with all of their kit cut off them, each with a medic working on them. And just, as I said, a vision of hell just because of what had happened, but also carnage. People screaming at me, people shouting, people running around, just bedlam, basically, because of people on overload, sensory overload, myself included. And I looked at this scene, and I remember just this. I was very lucky, and I suppose I don't know what your instructors are like here particularly, but at Sandhurst, the education, we're trained by colour sergeants, and they shout at you out on the drill square. And I had a colour sergeant voice in my head just scream at me, if ever there was a moment to do your job, it is right now. Get in the fight. Because to be honest, I was being overwhelmed by what I was seeing. And I was starting to just sort of feel like I was in treacle. I wasn't reacting the way I wanted to react. And this voice just brought me into the present. And I could just see this carnage, people shouting information at me, and I just started to work the problem. So again, interesting. I think repetition is reinforcement, and you'll hear some of my points will be similar to some of the points you've heard. Firstly, I positioned myself in a place where I could see exactly what was going on. I could see deep and I could see close. So I knelt almost in the middle of the incident. What had happened was, as 3 guys transited across a junction, a suicide bomber stepped out a door, walked straight into the middle of them and detonated himself. Obviously, we found that out afterwards. So he detonated himself very close to the soldiers, so hence why you can imagine what the scene was like. And I started just to work the problem, calmly, just working through it, gathering the facts, sending the information over my radio back to my headquarters. I was very conscious about my wording on the radio because we work on an all-informed net. And if I said, for example, he's dead on the radio, all of the people on that patrol with the radio, which is about a third of them, would have heard that. And I didn't want to set that sort of words in my soldiers' minds. So I was having to use correct phraseology. I was having to try and get the medical evacuation as quickly as possible, but also conscious that there's a 20-minute flight time. The next situation I was faced with was, just off to the left, was a textbook definition perfect helicopter landing site for a CH-47 for a Chinook. I mean, the dimensions were perfect. There was the gaps in compounds, there was an open field, it was absolutely perfect. So my plan was to bring the CH-47 medical evacuation helicopter straight into that field, get my soldiers in the back of that, because there's a surgical team on board, and hopefully save their lives. I then on the radio am told another intelligence update that the enemy have still got the big thing and that they're ready. What we deduced from that was the RPG crew was still there. They also knew that we were taking casualties and that we would bring a helicopter in and they would shoot the helicopter down. So they then had to make the hardest decision of my life, which was what I wanted to do was save my soldiers, but what I needed to do was not make the situation worse. And a Chinook getting shot down on the ground with one of our surgical teams on board is going to make a really bad situation into a disaster. So I had to change the helicopter landing site to one about 1.5 kilometers away. I called for my vehicle quick reaction force. They flew out, whizzed out in the vehicles, picked up my soldiers, drove out to the desert, put them into the back of the Chinook, and off they went. And if you imagine, this whole incident has taken about an hour and a half. I've described it quickly, but about an hour and a half. Bear in mind, just as it started, I was told that we'd just run out of water. People were running out of water. So it's about midday now, so it's about 45 degrees centigrade. People have run out of water. We've got a kilometre walk back to the fob, and it was hideous, because people have been part of this incident, and we just had this slow, painful walk where I really was thinking through leadership and what I should do. We got back in, and I realised what I had to do was make a speech. I had to talk to the lads, and I had to do something. I had to do it in a way that would help them. And again, the point about knowing your people that was mentioned earlier by the former FBI director about understanding your people, understand the buttons you have to push at the right time. So I gave them a speech that would sort of resonate with my soldiers, the paratroopers, and any of the US Marine Corps in the audience, and that kind of mentality. I just said to my soldiers, go back to your accommodation, sort yourselves out, get hydrated, make sure your weapons are clean, because tomorrow we go back out, we find who did this, and we kill them. And I need you to be ready for that. And that's what they needed to hear at that time. I then had a period of about an hour before I was then radioed and informed that all 3 soldiers had died. They'd all got back to the hospital, but all 3 had died. So I then had to deal with what I would call the sort of the longer-term leadership challenges. If you imagine the short-term leadership challenges of making the decision in the incident, you've then got the longer challenge of dealing with your soldiers who've just lost 3 soldiers from 1 platoon in 1 incident. And I just want to sort of draw out a couple of lessons which I picked up on, and my single lesson, and then hopefully that you'll be able to come back to me on that, the questions. I think the first one, as I said, was make the decisions. When you're a leader, you are there to make decisions. So get yourself into the right position and make the decisions. I made the decision on the Chinook, and my mantra, which I really learned during the tour, was understand the difference between what you want to do and what you need to do. What I wanted to do was save my soldiers. What I needed to do was not make the situation worse. And I had a number of times that mantra was reinforced to me. You've got to keep calm. A leader is infectious. How you are behaving resonates to all of those around you. And if you arrive in a scene of panic, if you panic, you're just compounding it. People are watching you. People are listening to you. A brilliant piece of advice I was given was every time before you go on your radio, in fact, this is an SAS commander gave me this advice, and it's brilliant. He said, every time before you go on the radio, just think to yourself, cool on the net. And he did it in a Bob Marley accent. I said, sorry? He said, cool on the net, cool on the net. Because when you speak on your radio, every single person can hear you. And if you're flapping, running around, screaming, people will start to panic. You've got to work the problem. You've got to work the problem that as the evidence is presented to you. We're humans. We are all really bad at trying to distort a problem to make it fit what we kind of like it to do. I would have loved that RPG team not to have been there, but they were there. So you've got to work the problems based on the evidence that's being presented to you. You've got to be the person that the people need you to be. So, for example, when I made the speech to the soldiers, I was the gung-ho, we're going to go back out there and kill them. And the lads nodding off they went. Once we informed the company that people had died, I spent time walking around, and I was whatever that person needed me to be. So some people want to be left alone, I left them. Some people just wanted to have a chat. Some people wanted to talk about religion, and other people wanted a hug. I hugged one of my sergeants as he started crying because he was one of the medics and felt he had failed because the soldier had died, and it was his fault. So I gave him a hug because he needed a hug. So don't be afraid of being the person that they need you to be. But finally, my epiphany came to me. My single lesson, if I can give you one, was leadership is all about those below you. It is all about those that you are responsible for. Higher headquarters in the crisis are irrelevant. And to be honest, you are irrelevant. How you feel, your emotion, is utterly irrelevant. You've got to park that for later on and concentrate on those under your command and be the person that they need you to be. Okay? They need you right now more than you need yourself, or higher headquarters need you. So be responsible and act for them to help get them through the crisis, because ultimately that's what you're there to do. If you're the commander, you're the leader, you've got to lead them through this. Thank you.
Thank you, Russ. Our third and final panelist is J.D. Messenger. Mr. Messenger began his adult life as a fireman and made his way to the U.S. Naval Academy with the class of 1981. He served as a nuclear submarine officer after graduating with distinction from the Academy, left active duty to apply his talents in the corporate sector, and is now the best-selling author of 11 Days in May, The Conversation That Will Change Your Life, and also a television and radio creator, producer, and host, and the chief executive officer of the Messenger Group. Along his journey, he also served as the CEO of Ernst & Young Singapore, a senior advisor to the Singapore Prime Minister, and the Exxon executive who helped supervise the Exxon Valdez oil spill cleanup in Alaska. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Messenger.
It is absolutely an honor to be here, and I'd like to thank the organizers and the individuals who've sponsored it. This is a fabulous opportunity for those of you. And when I was talking to you last night, I realized that most of you were not even born in 1989, and I want to talk about the Exxon Valdez spill. So I'll give you the situation, and I'll tell you some of the things that happened, and then summarize some of the short lessons for you. In 1989, the Exxon Valdez, which was a supertanker, crashed into the rocks in Valdez, Alaska, which is a very extreme, remote area in the country and the world. It spilled 11 million gallons of crude oil into one of the most pristine and beautiful environments in the world. It killed 500,000 birds, 50,000 otters. It destroyed the livelihood of all of the salmon fishermen, and as you can suspect, was, I believe at the time, essentially one of the world's worst economical disasters. And I was called in to supervise the task force because I was a Naval Academy graduate and had experience in military operations, and I don't know whether I'm either in the right place at the wrong time or in the wrong place at the right time, but it seems to be a pattern in my life. And so I went up there, and let me kind of give you the situation. The oil was spilled over 1,000 miles of shoreline. The shoreline, which we called the beach, was something that resembled greased bowling balls because it's volcanic rock. So our first challenge is to learn how to navigate walking across greased bowling balls. If you successfully do that, then try to avoid the 8 to 10 foot grizzly bears who don't like you interfering with their salmon fishing. And if you survive those things, whatever you do, don't fall in the water, because the water, you will die of hypothermia in 2 to 3 minutes. On top of all that, we are 100 miles away from anywhere, and anywhere is this tiny little port called Valdez, which is hundreds of miles from the largest city, which is in Anchorage. We have to bring in all of our food and water. Occasionally, there's these storms that whip up. Within 30 minutes, you can have 60-mile-an-hour winds and 15-foot seas. And while you're in the midst of trying to survive all this, there's politicians, congressmen, senators, CNN sticking the camera in your face, and everyone who thinks that you're an evil person because this oil has spilt all over the beach. And so our mission is, whether we like it or not, to clean that oil up. And I want to tell you just a particular story. I could tell many stories. It was a very dynamic environment, and so dynamic that there was no possible way. My command ship was a Navy LST. We had over 1,000 people and 120 ships and aircraft ferrying in everything we needed. We had C-141s flying around the world 24/7. Whatever it was I needed could be got anywhere in the world and on the deck in front of me in 24 hours. We had used 25% of the world's communication capability at the time, and I spent over $1 billion in 8 months signing chits, and this, sort of gives you the sense for what it's like. When the first day I arrived, my turnover was supposed to be 3 hours, and the man I was relieving, a plane crashed in the water, and so my turnover was about 5 minutes. So this is the way it was every moment of every day, fighting the press, the bears, the environmentalists, and trying to get your job done. So cakewalk, right? We did have people fall in the water and die. We did have people attacked by bears. We did have people attacked by environmentalists. We did have people die of heart attacks. And when I was going through getting my own supply of survival equipment and all that, there was this giant thing that kind of looked like a big fire extinguisher. And I said, what is that? I didn't get one of those. And they said, oh, that's the grizzly bear repellent. I said, oh, that's good. And they said, why is it good? I thought it was the mosquito repellent. Because you also, if you are familiar with Alaska, you can be eaten alive by the mosquitoes. So a couple of scenarios that took place. One of the scenarios was that we were trying to get the shoreline cleaned, and in order to get all the shoreline cleaned, we had to have the approval of the EPA and the Environmental Department of Environmental Conservation and the health folks, and of course all the oil spill folks. So here we are, 1,000 people trying to clean 1,000 miles of shoreline in about 8 weeks. And everyone agrees that we had finished doing what we were supposed to do, and every one of these officials, Army, or Navy, Navy, Coast Guard, ADEC, NOAA, EPA, everyone has to sign off on a form, and everyone had signed off on those forms except the Alaska State of Environmental Conservation. They essentially would not accept that we had done our job. And so even though we had done our job, we were being reported as not having accomplished anything. And so I fly to I had a helicopter because we're going over 1,000 miles, so I would take a helicopter and fly to shoreline, accident, incident, whatever it was. And there was a CNN cameraman who followed me everywhere. And I was trying to figure out how am I going to get the Environmental Conservation Department to agree that we have cleaned up the shoreline. And so I looked over my shoulder, and there was the CNN man, and I said, I've got a story for you. And he said, what's that? I said, you're going to see us sign off all of the paperwork that we've cleaned up, 2 miles of shoreline today. Really, you guys haven't done that at all? I said, yeah, it's going to happen today. You can film the paper. And he said, great. So I got all these people together and handed around the forms, and NOAA signed off, and Alaska Governor's Office signed off, and the Environmental Conservation signed off, and the EPA signed off, and the engineers signed off, and it went to the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservationists, and he looked around and he saw the camera there, and he decided he'd better sign off on all the papers, and so he signed off on the papers. And that may sound manipulative. However, I consider it to be innovative. Another situation that occurred was that we had to put fertilizer all over the shoreline, meaning the process of using hot water to clean the shorelines was destroying all of the bioorganisms. And so EPA and NOAA and all of the scientists said we're going to spray fertilizer, potassium, phosphorus, nitrogen on the shoreline. And that would help reproduce the microorganisms, which would help the oil biodegrade, which, if you're familiar with anything that I'm talking about, an oil spill response, the whole procedure really is to do nothing. You shouldn't clean up. You should let nature do its work, because there's billions of barrels of oil going into the water every day, and the best response is to allow nature to biodegrade. And so everything that we had been doing was actually not a productive thing. It wasn't something that the people in the industry wanted. It was something that political pressure and environmentalists had sort of forced, which is another experience in a lot of crisis, is that sometimes the crisis is actually worse than what happens as a result of various constituents getting involved, and in my experience, making things worse. But be that as it may, we had steamed the beach, we had killed the bioorganisms, and we needed to help nature grow back. So we were putting this fertilizer along the shoreline. Now, the challenge was we had, at this point, less than 2 weeks to spray the fertilizer. There was only one factory in the world that made this fertilizer, and it was going to be August, and they were in France, and they were all about to close and go on vacation. This fertilizer needed to be kept at 98 degrees in the middle of the Gulf of Alaska, and we had to figure out some way of getting fertilizer sprayed over 1,000 miles of shoreline. So we tried to innovate and think about everything we could do. We had fertilizer device and sprayers flown in from all over the world. We ended up buying the factory in France for $10 million and putting them back to work and doubling their salaries and giving them the month of September off. We had to build a barge in the middle of the Gulf of Alaska as a depot, as a storage. We had no idea what we were going to be storing or how we were going to store it, but we knew that we had to have it there in 12 days. So I ordered 3 barges to be sent to the middle of the Gulf with nothing on them. And the individuals responsible said, "Why are we doing that?" I said, "Because by the time they're going to drop an anchor, we'll have an answer to the problem." And the answer to that problem was I found a building in Anchorage, and bought the building, cut it in 4 pieces, and had helicopters fly it out. And so when they dropped the anchor, we dropped the building on. We dropped 4,000 gallons of diesel fuel and generators and insulation, and we turned it into a 98-degree insulated building. We were called the Bioremediation Application Team, so we called that the Bat Cave. We had to build speedboats because we had to distribute this fertilizer over 1,000 miles from one bat cave, and we had 2 weeks to do it, so I had to buy jet boats that could go 60 miles an hour. And we then had to insulate them so they looked like little bubbled insulated UFOs or something. We called those Batmobiles. And I, of course, was called Batman. So the first day we went to spray this fertilizer on the beach, we picked a secret test site because we knew that this was not the popular thing to do. And so we sprayed the fertilizer on the beach. And the next morning, I was delivered the newspaper. I won't mention what newspaper it was. It had nothing to do with the state of New York. I'm sure it was not the New York Times. And on the front page of the newspaper, no, seriously, it was not the New York Times. But on the front page of the newspaper was this picture of a dead whale. And it said, "Dead whale found on test site." And so it had a picture of the dead whale on this test site where we had sprayed potassium, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And it implied, of course, that the whale was killed by these nasty chemicals. And there was no mention of the whale in the story. But of course, lots of cameramen show up. And the interesting thing about that whale is that it had metaphysical abilities. It was teleporting itself to all kinds of different test sites and locations. So we had to get the admiral with his 325-foot Coast Guard cutter to take that whale out and ceremoniously bury him in the middle of the ocean because he was causing a lot of trouble. The summary to all this is the most important thing, in my opinion, is that if you are a crisis leader, you must know your moral rudder. You must know your personal philosophy, because you will get pulled into legal issues, financial issues, environmental issues, and if you don't know where you stand, if you don't know why you're doing what you're doing, and uphold those values and beliefs, you will be ripped in half. I could have been ripped into 10 different pieces every single day by the news, the environmentalists, you know, so on and so on. My job was to clean up that environment. And I think it was a noble cause. And it required integrity. It required me being on the front line. It required, you know, being adaptive and creative. But more than anything, it required knowing who you are and what you believe in. So.
Thank you, J.D. So there's a wide variety to choose from air traffic control to Afghanistan to an environmental cleanup. But there are 2 microphones up here. We have an opportunity to do questions and answers. You can either ask a question in general to the panel as a whole or specify who you'd like to at least take it on first. But this is the opportunity to get some further insights from these fine gentlemen. So again, 2 microphones up front. Please come on up. Go ahead.
Gentlemen, in the military, we try to make our training all realistic and challenging to make it as similar to the real life thing as possible. But the real fear and stress of like a real crisis can cause people to freeze and become indecisive. And so how do you get over that paralyzing stress of real crisis?
So go ahead, whoever would like to start.
I long ago wrote something that fear is the false expectation of an anticipated result that you do not want. And so you can tell yourself there's no such thing as fear, but all that does is program in your mind that you are fearful, because our mind is a supercomputer that doesn't know the difference between, you know, the word fear. And so no matter how many times you say, I'm not fearful, you're programming yourself to be fearful. So you have to develop those positive affirmations and constantly reinforce that you are courageous and that you are serving a noble cause and that you believe in yourself and you trust yourself and you trust your team. In my particular case, I'm a collaborator. I always like to bring the people around me and ask them, you know, get the front line involved. Pull in the troops and get everyone there and collect all of the facts and information. And then you usually have to make your most difficult decisions alone, but you need to do it in the face of all the facts and information. So I think that building that team together, keep reaffirming to yourself why you're doing what you're doing, and then making your decision on your personal philosophy.
Go ahead, Russ.
Yeah. You've raised the point about training, and I think you can actually do it in training, but you've highlighted really well the limitations of training, but don't underestimate training. And you can build the stress in by, you're never going to train for the scenario, but you can train for a scenario, and the stress and the fear that you'll go through in that can be just as useful for your sort of experience bank. And so, for example, live firing, you know, you need to make live firing as realistic and as dangerous as possible, up to the point of it being stupid. Need to consider things like adventure training, we call it, but taking someone rock climbing. You know, if you've got a young soldier who doesn't like heights, then taking him rock climbing is going to scare him witless. But you're teaching him to overcome that fear. So, you know, don't be afraid of topping people's fear banks up, but you have raised the limitation really well, which is it can't always work. But, you know, don't be afraid of scaring yourself, I think it is the one. And don't be afraid of scaring those under your command, but up to a point.
Anything?
I would add that certainly there was a lot of fear prevalent in the command center on 9/11 as people worried about their families, about what was going on, whether or not the nation was under attack, what should be done. And I joined in those fears, but as the senior person, I felt I had an obligation to present an aura of calmness and of command, and to reassure them by my actions. And that's what I tried to do. But I think the fear of the actions that you're going to take is always running an undercurrent.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Emily Huff. I'm a student at MIT with the Gordon Engineering Leadership Program. And Mr. Messenger, this question is specifically for you, but feel free to answer as well. But when you're talking about the crisis, you mentioned a lot about how important it is for your personal philosophy to be very strong. I'm curious, what is your personal philosophy? Was it strengthened by anything you would have done differently, looking back? What did you really learn throughout leading all of this?
That's a great question. You know, seeing the most pristine environment, I love the water, I love the ocean. There would be whales jumping around, and then you see in the midst of all this beauty, this terrible destruction. My personal belief is that we are all here to serve, that we are a part of something bigger than ourselves, that we all have a purpose, and that I'm a part of the air I breathe and the water I drink and the minerals I consume. And so to see the environment being destroyed was very upsetting to me. To see the nation tearing itself apart, because it was a very, very vicious thing. I mean, gasoline prices shot up all over the world. The gasoline stores that I was the sales manager of were being bombed. You know, so you have to realize that we're all human and we make mistakes, and that, you know, people can be forgiven, and that, you know, you got to get by that. You have to step above. I mean, the individualistic, petty sort of human condition, if you're going to be a successful crisis leader, and rise above and align everyone and inspire them and remind them why you're there, you know, what you're doing. It's not about the laws, it's not about the environmental issue. You've got a mission to do, and we've got to work together to solve that mission. And if we get down and mired in the muck and the bickering and all those individual issues, we're never going to accomplish our mission. So elevating, you know, pulling them up to recognize that we're there to serve a noble purpose that is bigger than ourselves, bigger than a law, bigger than this spill.
Other comments?
Yeah, agree with
Okay.
that.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Hi, my name is Abby. I'm from the University of Pennsylvania, and my question goes to anyone on the panel. But Major Lewis, you mentioned that a leader needs to be the person that their team needs them to be. However, a lot of people respond to crises in different ways, and a lot of times emotionally. So my question is, how do you determine what that person needs at that time, and how to best approach each individual?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it goes back to, it's been mentioned a couple of times before about knowing your people. And I suppose it reinforces, my big theme is about training. That, you know, what prepares you and prepares your team is training. Scenario training, discussions, whatever you do. But it's also through your training that you will see people's strengths and weaknesses, people's characters, and hopefully through that and getting to know them, you'll be able to fuse those two bits of information together. going back to, you know, I definitely wouldn't use his name, but the guy I gave the hug to was one of the toughest guys I've ever met in my career. And so it was a sort of bold call, because putting my arm around him may have gone catastrophically wrong. But I just knew it was so out of character the way he was reacting that he just needed a human touch. He needed to know that someone cared. And so, yeah, I think it's just about, you know your team, but the way you get to know them and the individuals is through training.
I would add that you need to be authentic. You know, we all have a heart, and it may sound strange, but I learned that crying was a really good thing. And that when I cried, that my people realized that I was human, and they would follow you even more, because you recognized and sort of admitted that you're not perfect and that this was upsetting. So crying can be a good thing.
Go ahead.
I'm Chris Teska from the Naval Academy. My question is specifically for Mr. Sliney, but also for Major Lewis. You guys both were in command of an organization during a time of crisis, and Mr. Sliney specifically, you were immediately in a time of crisis. How is it that you transitioned from the crisis leadership into something where you needed to be very normal and very calm on a day-to-day, specifically in a kind of bureaucracy like the FAA?
How do you transition from the crisis to sort of back to normality?
From choppy waters to clean,
Yes,
calm waters.
Sorry. My hearing's going. A lifetime of headsets going off in my ear. Well, usually it's, for me, it's a matter of duty. Once the crisis, so to speak, is over, once all the aircraft had landed and another foot hadn't fallen, another aircraft hadn't crashed. So I knew it was, actually I started to get the calmness of knowing that the crisis was over maybe about 2/3 of the way through all the aircraft landing. And now we had to set out to do our job. So when we go to the calm waters, meaning that the initial chaos in getting all the aircraft down is over, now became the more mundane jobs, such as people wanted to fly. The Texas Rangers police called and wanted to send a helicopter out to a remote accident site to get a victim. And of course, I authorized that, knowing full well that my feel was that the military would shoot down anyone they saw in the air. But you become absorbed, I think, in the activities that are dictated by the crisis that just passed. And there's always an opportunity, or there's a necessity to continue to do your job, which is to run the airspace safely and efficiently. So for me, it was just more activity after the initial crisis that enabled me to accomplish that.
Yeah, very similar actually. I think the first thing is that the heavy waters make you stronger. You know, you're all stronger for the experience, as uncomfortable as they are, and the organisation is better for it as long as you pop out the other side in good order. But it's almost exactly the same, which is we felt we had a duty to get right back out there. You know, we now, in fact, the duty was even higher because we owed it to our 3 fallen comrades to get back out there and do the job even better. And so the transition was quite neat into the sort of the calm seas. And very quickly things were sort of almost running as normal. It sounds awful, but things do just revert back to normality quite quickly. But sort of a word of warning with it is there's a real feeling of time distortion. I don't know what the other two felt, but I remember 2 days after this suicide bomber event, you know, and we're almost back to normal for, you know, sort of schedules and rosters and patrols, and everything's back to normal. But I remember just sitting down thinking about it and suddenly thinking it felt like it was 4 weeks ago and it was only 2 days ago. And so you find there's a time distortion, but it is amazing how resilient people are and how quickly people just get back into doing their job properly.
Thank you.
My name is Lieutenant Colonel Dan Smith. I teach organizational psychology and leadership at West Point. Mr. Messenger, you spoke pretty compellingly about how taking bold action during that crisis made you a target of everyone's anger and hatred over this thing, and your moral rudder helped you get through that.
I'm also short and I move fast.
Right. I was hoping, it also struck me though that our other two panelists also took bold action during a crisis, and it strikes me that it likely made you a target as well. People may have second-guessed your decision to move to another landing zone, and they may have blamed you, saying that those soldiers died because you made that decision, right? Or I'm sure, I don't know as much about the FAA as I do military operations, but I'm sure people likely may have second-guessed your decisions. Can you talk a little bit about that, and can we hear about that aspect of it from you?
Well, I could say I had opened the line to headquarters and staffed it with a senior colleague so that we could keep the lines of communication open and try to give them, we gave them all the information that we had. We didn't get too much back, but after I had given the order to land everyone, I walked over to my colleague who was manning that line, and I said, you know, have you heard, and this is, you know, an hour later, I said, have you heard anything from headquarters? And he said, well, you're going to love this. He said, they called and said they wanted us to land everyone, and I told them that we already had done that. And they demanded to know who did that. And he said, Ben Sliney, the NOM, did that. Then they called back 20 minutes later and demanded to know why I hadn't done it sooner. So you learn in dealing in a bureaucracy that someone's always going to second guess your decisions. For me, the certainty or the comfort in knowing that there's a right thing to do in the situation is enough for me. And of course, displacing the entire nation's air carrier fleet ran into the billions and billions of dollars when calculated out the loss of revenues from, you know, the airports, the hotels. It just was a huge amount of money. And certainly it ran through my mind, but as an aside, the right thing to do was to get control over the sky, and it was that guided me in that moment.
I think mine's the quote, and it's, sorry just to sort of do quotes, but it's not the critic that counts, the man in the arena. That people are always going to second guess you, but they have that luxury. And if you were the man or the woman in the arena, and you made the decisions, the right decisions that you felt were the right decisions on the information that was being presented to you, then no one's in a position to second guess you. You know, you were the man in that moment, and that's up to them. Just got to, but people are always going to criticize your decisions.
Yeah, a crisis leader is not a popularity contest. One situation we had was we had 500 people arrive to replace burnt-out beach crews, and they were supposed to go on a new floating hotel platform, and the night before, the floating platform caught on fire, and the good news was that the flooding put the fire out. And so I called up the admiral in the Navy, and I said, sir, I know you want your LST back tomorrow, but I'm sorry, you can't have it. And he said, what do you mean I can't have it? I said, well, you can't have it. I've got 500 people that need to sleep somewhere, and so we're going to keep it. Well, you might imagine what he said to me, but I said, well, I'm really sorry. But I'm keeping your ship. And, you know, you don't make friends, but that's not what you're there to do. You're there to get a job done.
Okay, so I'm going to make one of those decisions. We're going to have only 2 more questions, so unfortunately those that are behind these 2, you can come up afterwards, and I'm sure the panelists would be glad to spend a couple of minutes with you, but we're going to hit your question, and your answers are going to have to be a little brief so that we can stick to the time schedule. Go ahead.
Okay, my question's directed to Mr. Sliney, but I'm interested in the other panelists' response as well. So you mentioned on the day of 9/11, you didn't expect that the hijackers were piloting the planes, and that was sort of a paradigm that you were trapped in. And obviously, like, no one, could have predicted that. But I was wondering what you learned from that in the sense that how do you prepare yourself for a situation that there was no training for, that you never thought you would have encountered, if there is any way to prepare yourself?
Well, that's a good question. I think that when you undertake a particular responsibility, that with that comes the notion that not everything is going to go as you planned. And certainly there's no precedent for 9/11. That was completely unprecedented. And I mentioned that paradox in my mind. I could not get it out of my head how they could force that a pilot to fly, even with a knife to his or her throat. They would put it someplace that would be the most benign, if that's the correct word. But I think that you prepare yourself in the course of your career by learning to gather as much information as possible, and relied upon my staff to give me as much information as possible. Even though there was no precedent for what was occurring that day, there are still basic tenets of my position, which was to try to get control over and make safer the airspace in the United States. The decisions were just born of that desire to accomplish the task that I had been given.
Thank you.
All right, why don't we go ahead and finish up with your question?
My name is Dominic. I'm from Penn State University. And my question is that leaders are often, well, almost always, they're passionate individuals, very driven by emotion. So kind of in the moment of crisis, is there anything kind of you say in your head or anything that you've encountered or remembered that kind of has allowed you to remember to keep calm and think logically and kind of put the emotions aside? I know all of you kind of touched on this, but if you could expand upon it.
Yeah, mine, as I said, was cool on the net. You do need a mantra. Training is my mantra. You've got to train. But I studied NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. But very simply, it's about visualization. Visualizing how you want to behave in an incident, and giving yourself physical and auditory keys, like something you do or something you say to yourself, is definitely the way forward in my mind. So visually practice the event. Add yourself a phrase to it. Mine is cool on the net. When I say, even as I say it now to you, I feel myself just relaxing slightly. But you have to practice that. That won't work on the day if you've just thought of it. You have to practice and practice, and then on the day, hopefully, that is what will work for you.
I totally agree. I do that. I always visualize that future state, and I also have my own program code, and mine comes from Disney, and it's Dory, and it's keep on swimming, and that's intentionally funny. Yeah. Because you notice I like to tell jokes, and I like to make it funny, because what I've realized is it's important to keep a sense of humor. It's important to balance this. And, even though bad things are happening, you crack a joke, you say something funny, it relaxes people, And so keep on swimming, everyone gets a chuckle, and you kind of go,
Mr. Sliney, last word?
I agree with those sentiments precisely. I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay. Well, this has been an outstanding panel because of our panelists and their experience and what they've brought forth. I'd like you to perhaps remember three things. You may have picked up other pieces, but one is definitely this idea of how important it is to portray confidence and calmness as you are trying to steady the helm in those heavy waters. The second one is you've got to make decisions. You're going to have to make decisions, and at times they are going to be unpopular. And the third one is, as has been mentioned numerous times, maintaining your moral compass. That this will not just be a set of tactical decisions, whether it's on the corporate, educational, or military side. There are ethical and moral components to it, and you will be tested. So if your moral compass is not in good shape before you go into the crisis, it's not going to get better in the crisis. I think it was Lord Moran who said that the man of character in peace becomes the man of courage in war, and I think that really wraps it up. So I'd like to thank Mr. Sliney, I'd like to thank Major Lewis and Mr. Messenger. not only for being here today, but for what you've contributed to the world in many ways of the actions that you took that made a lot of difference. So thank you again for joining us, and I'll turn it back over to the chairwoman.
Yes, thank you again. On behalf of the Naval Academy and the Leadership Conference staff, we'd like to present each of you with a gift as a token of our appreciation for coming and speaking with us today.